Well, welcome everybody. The first presentation, this is a set of two presentations. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you also to the Zoom audience who is also joining us. The first presentation is by Susan Knight, and that will be on wild rice decline in northern Wisconsin. That's for 20 minutes. And then Carly Lapin and Nathan Podney. Oh, thank you. We'll be speaking about returning wild rice to Spur Lake in Oneida County along an unfinished journey. So Susan first, she's an associate scientist at Trout Lake Station, a field station for the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Limnology in Boulder Junction. Her work involves research on wild rice, aquatic invasive plants, aquatic plant identification, plant surveys, and review of the statewide lake management plans. Ready?
Thanks, Sandy. Bring water up. Okay, now let's see if I can coordinate this. Okay, thanks everybody. I actually spoke about this project last year at the Lake Convention as well. So this is an update, a little bit of a repeat, but we now have 2 years of field data. So I'm going to just continue on, do a little recap of what we did last year, and then bring you up to speed on what we're doing, what we did last summer, and what we hope to do in the future. So my partner in crime here is Gretchen Gerrish, and Gretchen gave the talk this morning about zooplankton. Hope you all heard it. And we had an intern for 2 years, Erin Matula, who's now a graduate student up in Peterborough, Canada. And I will. Gotcha. Okay. So, anyway, we took this project on mostly because wild rice is of great interest to many people up in the Northwoods. It's an annual, it's known as manumin by the Ojibwa. It is an annual aquatic grass, which means that it is a grass, so it grows in the water, which is kind of unusual for Wisconsin. We don't have that many grasses that grow in the water. And it is an annual, which means that it must come back from seed every year. So the seeds are very important. It has an edible grain that I'm sure a lot of you know is very tasty and very nutritious. And if it's processed properly, it can be stored for long periods of time. And so is quite a staple for the Ojibwa who lived in the area. It thrives in low-grade water. That means not very swift streams, just kind of slow-moving streams, or in lakes, especially where we have found it is in lakes right where the stream is coming in. It's very finicky about where it grows. It is not found in all that many places, but it is pretty widespread in the upper Midwest because we are so water rich and because we don't have any really big mountains. It's the perfect habitat for this slow moving water. This is where wild rice likes to live. So this is its life cycle, and I'm going to go through some pictures in a second, but whoopsie, I'm sorry, go back. This is the mature plant here with flowers on it, and then its seeds. The seeds fall and they germinate into, they put out a couple little roots and they'll shoot. They grow for a while, they float on the surface for a while, the leaves just float right on the surface. And then the plant becomes emergent, and then eventually it flowers and fruits. But this all happens within 1 season. So some of the pictures, this is germinating wild rice seeds. These seeds are very large. So the seed itself is, roughly close to 1 inch long, with a long awn that makes the whole seed kind of even longer. And here it is just starting to germinate in the early spring, just after ice out. This is the plant when it's at its submerged stage. And so it's just, you can see they're just little green shoots coming up with very pointy, the tip of the leaf is very pointy. It's the easiest way to identify it. Here it is at its floating stage, and it looks like a couple of other plants, but you can identify it usually because of the pointy leaves. And then eventually it starts to stand up. And this is my favorite stage of the rice. It looks like, like little babies just starting to stand up and waddle around. And so some of the plants are still in their floating stage, and some of them are becoming emergent. Finally, you get so that the entire population is really standing up and is emergent. You can see a few pond lilies mixed in here. And then finally, it starts to flower and fruit. The female flowers are first. I think I've got another picture of there at the top. And then these floppy anthers are down at the bottom. These are the seeds that it produces. These are some non-successful seeds, so they did not fill. There are a lot of threats to wild rice. As you can see from this figure up here, where it's really the most common is up here in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and to a certain extent in Michigan. I don't think Ontario was included, because there are parts of Ontario where wild rice does pretty well too. But there are a whole lot of threats to wild rice. We are kind of at the north, at the southern edge of this wild rice. So as climate change starts to kind of rear its ugly head, we may lose it completely. Oops, sorry. We also have some of the other problems are with swans and other herbivores, such as geese, and even rice worms will kind of do a number on wild rice. We also have other competing emergent plants like this pickerel weed, and other floating leaf vegetation like these pond lilies are all competing with rice to a certain extent. We also have invasive species, aquatic invasive species like Eurasian water milfoil and curly leaf pondweed. There are also other issues like dams, either put in naturally by beaver or put in by people, that have really changed the landscape in northern Wisconsin for sure. Not so much of a problem if you have a dam upstream from a wild rice population, but a big problem if you have one downstream. And sometimes if the seed bank is extremely important. So if your seed bank is depleted, that is the supply of seeds in the sediments, it might take a while before you it might take several years before that seed bank is completely depleted. But unless you get a good crop of wild rice, you're not going to replenish that seed bank. So our research question was, why are some of the populations doing well? Because there are some populations that are doing pretty well. Our hypothesis was that early season may have a critical, early season features may have, or variables may have a really important impact on how wild rice does. We decided to study 6 lakes, 2 that were doing well for wild rice, 2 that were doing poorly, and 2 that were bumping into invasive species. The data we collected included water depth, temperature, and oxygen, growth in the stage of wild rice, like whether it was submerged or floating or whatever, the aquatic plant neighbors, all the different aquatic plants we saw growing with the wild rice, whether or not we saw waterfowl, and then we also assessed the seed bank. So the 2 lakes that we thought were abundant, one was Wild Rice Lake, which really is doing well. The other lake was Aurora, which once we got out there, realized it wasn't doing quite as well as has been historically. Island was one of our invaded lakes, actually has curly leaf pondweed, but it actually, even though it does have curly leaf pondweed, it turned out after that first year we discovered it really isn't interacting with the curly leaf pondweed. It doesn't, the curly leaf grows much deeper than the rice, doesn't seem to be interfering at all. The other lake, we started with Watersmeet Lake, but we found little rice and little Eurasian water milfoil. We switched to Oneida Lake, which is in Oneida County, and it has a good population of rice and a good population of Eurasian water milfoil, and we're just starting to look at the data there. Finally, that's Eurasian water milfoil. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. The lost lakes, one of them is Aliquosh, which is really dominated by floating leaf vegetation now, and Irving Lake, which is where the rice used to be all over, and at least where we found some rice growing, it's also very much interacting with immersed plants like pickerel weed and arrowhead, and also a lot of floating vegetation like pond lilies. So this was our experiment, and we have had 2 years to study this. This was our sampling design. This is our wild rice lake. The name of the lake is Wild Rice. It's not just wild rice. So, and we deliberately went from shore to shore, crossing this channel, which is the Trout River coming in here. And this is the body of the lake is actually over here. And so we would sample at these points, and we visited every lake. So this is just Wild Rice Lake. We did the same thing in the other lakes as well. Visited every lake every 2 weeks. And as I said, we looked for waterfowl. We did not see waterfowl in Wild Rice Lake. And then we had a quadrat, which was a ½ meter square. And we measured those variables that I described before, the temperature and DO, the percent of other plants, what was on the bottom, basically, whether it was thatch or bare. And we counted how many rice plants we saw and what stage they were at. And in 2021, we had the 2 lakes that were doing well and continued to do well were Wild Rice Lake, that I was just showing you the sampling sites from, and Island Lake, which is the one where the curly leaf pondweed kind of butts up against it, but doesn't really seem to have any effect. The other lakes we were looking at really had very little rice throughout the entire season. In 2022, we found pretty much the same thing, except we had added in Oneida Lake, which had a good population of wild rice. But as you can see, this is number of stems that I'm graphing here, and the number of stems were lower in 2022 than they were in 2021. Again, we didn't have much rice in either Aliquosh or in Irving Lake, but Aurora did seem to be doing a little bit better. The rice in Aurora kind of grows like bushes, and you end up with a whole lot of stems by the end of the year. The depth of the rice was did not really seem to change too much over the course of a couple of years. We thought that we had been told by some really Peter and Lisa David, who have done work on wild rice for many, many years and have worked for Glyphwick, have retired recently. They thought, when they saw our data, they thought the rice was actually growing. It usually grows better in shallower water, but actually in the lakes that we were looking at, our worst performing lakes were the 3 shallowest. Maybe they were too shallow. We don't really know. Of course, we're only looking at 6 lakes, but at any rate, the water levels were about the same in both years, and the depth profile of the rice was about the same in both years. And Waters Meet was in 2021, and then Oneida in 2022. So this is a graph of the height of the rice through the summer. This is day of the year. So this is mid-August here at the end. And the blue is, where have I got it? 2022, and the red is 2021. So in 2021, you can see that the plants did get taller, and they were always ahead of where they were in 2022. In Wild Rice Lake, the rice started out ahead, but actually it caught up in 2022. The rice was about the same height. And the thing that was happening was that in 2022, our ice went out a month later than it did in 2021. So we think that it looks like it slowed down the rice in 2022 because it didn't germinate early enough. but at least in Wild Rice Lake, it did catch up. So the phenology is we had fewer stems in 22 than in 21. The number of stems declined. In 2022, the plants experienced a growth lag until early July when they caught up, and the temperature and dissolved oxygen patterns stayed pretty much the same, and Aurora was doing better. I just want to take a minute, running out of time here a little bit, I'm sorry. We did take cores, and so we're taking a core in the sediment, nothing as official as what Paul was doing earlier, looking for seeds. And we did find, we took samples in the summer and we took samples in the fall. In the summer, because most of the seeds would have germinated by then. And so we wanted to see what the residual seed crop was like. And then in the fall, that would be after all of the seeds had matured and fallen in. So you would expect the seeds to be the number of seeds to be much higher in the fall, which they usually were, but we didn't really have all that many seeds at all in Aurora or Aliquosh or Irving, but we had a whole lot more seeds in Oneida and Wild Rice, which is in keeping with the population levels. So in summary, all the lakes seem to be of suitable depth. Maybe they're not ideal, but they seem to work okay. Only 2 lakes had abundant populations. That was Wild Rice and Island Lake, and Oneida was doing pretty well in 2022. The invaded lakes, Island has a little curly leaf, but it's not overlapping with the rice. Watersmeet has a little rice and a little Eurasian watermill or that was Watersmeet, I'm sorry. And Oneida is more abundant of both. And the high temperature period in June 2021, I didn't really talk about that, but we had a real hot span, which really seemed to affect the rice that was at its floating stage. And the oxygen went up at that time too. So, and the poorly producing lakes had the most floating vegetation and the most waterfowl and the most herbivory. So I think we're just going to do some point intercept surveys in the future. We're going to continue on our seed bank studies. We're thinking of doing some waterfowl exclusion enclosures or exclosures to see if that makes a big difference, set up some wildlife camps. And we're going to continue our phenological evaluation and possibly look at what kind of inputs we have from groundwater. And so thanks to everyone, thanks to the Wisconsin DNR who have funded this project, and to Onterra, Eddie Heath at Onterra, Peter and Lisa David, Kevin Gothier and Scott Van Egren, very helpful to us, and everyone at Trout Lake Station, and especially Joe Gravine from Lac du Flambeau, Band of the Lake Superior at Chippewa. And thank you very much.
We have about a minute and a half.
Yeah. That's kind of the traditional notion of wild rice. Well, I won't say it's not true. I mean, I'm kind of a neophyte to wild rice, but that is the long-standing tradition that it has a good year, a bad year, and 2 mediocre years. Whether or not it really follows that routinely, I don't know how true that is. I'm guessing it's not that regular, but that kind of contributes to whether or not you know whether or not the wild rice is declining, because if it is going through this 4-year cycle and you don't really know where you are in the cycle, you might be 8 years out and all of a sudden you still don't have any rice back and you don't really know why. So it adds on to the problem of trying to figure out whether or not the rice is sort of in this death spiral or it's going to come back sometime. Just don't know. Yeah. Yes. 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 We do not know, but it is true that those particular lakes are part of the are controlled by the Rest Lake Dam, which gets lowered in the fall and gets put back up. Both of them are pretty far back from the dam, and they both are right by where the streams are coming in. So I'm thinking that of all the parts of that whole watershed, they probably have less, they're probably less affected by that water level change from the dam than other parts. But maybe the change in water level actually is good for them. I don't know. And I also don't know what the rice would have been like that before the dam went in. It might have been a whole lot better. So we just don't know. No, I wouldn't say, let's see, can I say that? I would have to look back at the data that, my guess is that those lakes were the deepest and they might be slightly colder. The lakes that were Aliquosh and Irving were pretty shallow and they might have been warmer. So, but I'd have to go back and, yeah. Oh, is that it? Yeah.